Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, he's one of the most famous or infamous third-party candidates in U.S. history.
The ruling class has always liked to divide and rule. Red state, blue state, conservative, liberal.
We speak to Ralph Nader on defying the two-party political system. I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take.
Ladies and gentlemen, here's Ralph Nader.
The idea is not to just do jackpot politics. We've got to break up the two-party duopoly in this country. So many people are alienated from it.
That's author and political activist Ralph Nader, speaking at a town hall in Dayton, Ohio, when he was running for president of the United States. And that was in 1996. Along with his ambitions for higher office, he's known for his influential role in consumer and environmental protection in the U.S. He's the reason seatbelts became mandatory in 1966.
You can't believe how it was at the beginning, Malika. They would say, I'm trying to tie up the American people. I'm trying to abridge their freedom. So I would say, you mean abridge their freedom to go through a windshield? I'll plead guilty to that.
But he might be most well known for taking on the two-party system.
Hello, good morning.
Ralph Nader, it is good to have you on The Take. When we asked our listeners what election coverage they wanted to hear at the beginning of this U.S. election campaign, overwhelmingly, the answer we got back was, let's talk about third parties and their power or futility in a two-party system. As someone who ran for president twice for the Green Party in 1996 and 2000, and then as an independent in 2004 and 2008, what is the utility of a third-party vote if the system only privileges two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans?
Well, you don't have a democracy unless it's a competitive democracy at election time. If you have a two-party duopoly that thinks they own all the votes and any other third parties are interlopers, you have an oligopoly of politics. And that's what we have with the Republican Democratic parties. Historically, the function of third parties in an electoral college system has never really been to win elections, but to have new agendas. And the Liberty Party in 1840 launched the anti-slavery agenda. The women's suffrage parties in the 19th century pushed for women's right to vote. And then the farmer labor parties supported labor and farmer rights against, for example, the big railroads and the big banks and the new industries. So the voices and choices come from third parties. And in recent decades, the two parties have found ways to keep third-party candidates off the ballot. We have the most obstructive ballot access laws in the Western world. They also harass them. They file lawsuits. When I ran in 2004, we had 24 lawsuits in 12 weeks.
Wow.
Against us in state after state by the Democratic Party or its proxies. So we're dealing here with a fundamental issue of giving voters more voices and choices, or just saying to them, you got two choices, Democrat, Republican, they're the same on empire, the same on foreign policy, the same on Wall Street. They differ on social safety nets like Medicare and Social Security and pro-labor unions or anti-labor unions. But on major issues, they are very similar, and they behave that way in Congress.
You mentioned the lawsuits when you ran for president. Remind us of what it was like to get your name on the ballot as a third-party candidate.
Well, let's take Pennsylvania. We had enough signatures on our petition to get on the ballot in Pennsylvania. And one day we were notified that the lawyers for the Democratic Party had filed suit in courts in Pennsylvania to get us off the ballot. We can imagine, how do we find lawyers to defend ourselves in 25 lawsuits all at once? And they found some Democrat-appointed judges who were very congenial with getting us off the ballot, and we ended up in a terrible predicament. They did the same thing in Oregon. They actually called our petitioners at home and said, if you continue getting signatures, you could be violating criminal laws, which is totally false, but it scared some of our petitioners. So all over, they were harassing us. Instead of taking away our agenda, why didn't they take away the minimum wage increase? Why didn't they take away universal health insurance? Why didn't they take away a peace agenda? Because they're dialing for the same corporate commercial dollars as the Republicans. That's the top priority, raising money, money, money.
There's a story I read and heard about an incident in Ohio in which you had to fight for your place but were taken off the ballot because of signatures. Can you explain?
Yeah, here's a perfect example. We had a real dynamo getting signatures for us in Ohio. She got about 5,000 signatures. And every page of petition signatures had to be signed by her at the bottom. So she took all these signature pages to the Secretary of State in Ohio to file them. And the official looked at it and said, oh, your signature here at age 52 is not the same as it was when you registered to vote when you were 21.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, all the signatures were invalidated.
Huh.
Well, you try filing a lawsuit a few weeks before the election. It's impossible. So she lost 5,000 signatures. That's what's going on in this country.
Well, this November, voters who don't align with the Democrats or the Republicans do have other options on the ballot. Among them, Jill Stein of your former party, the Green Party.
We, the people, have a right to hear the candidates debate and to be informed and empowered.
Independents, Cornel West.
We need you to be part and parcel of wrestling with this corporate duopoly.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
I'm inviting all of you to join me to create an America that we can believe in and be proud of again.
Chase Oliver for the Libertarians.
I'm honored to be the first Libertarian candidate for president to ever campaign in all 50 states.
Others, as you mentioned, are still fighting for a spot on the ballot, like Claudia de la Cruz of the Party for Socialism and Liberation.
The real divide is not between the Democrats and the Republicans. The real divide is between the capitalists and the working class.
Can any of those candidates offer a viable, winnable alternative, or even, as you mentioned earlier, platforms that these major parties can borrow from?
No, because a lot of them can't get on many ballots at all. I mean, Cornel West will be lucky to get on 7 or 8 states out of 50. Jill Stein will get on probably over 40 states, as the Green Party has in recent years. And to show you what they have to offer is evidenced in an interview that in our new newspaper, Capitol Hill Citizen, of Jill Stein. And you'll see the agenda. There's nothing radical about it. It just favors workers, consumers, environment, waging peace instead of war overseas, restricting a bloated military budget and using the savings to rebuild America's public services and infrastructure, creating jobs and services in every community in the country. And she can't get on national TV. She can't get many articles in the major newspapers at all. She certainly can't get on the national presidential debates. In other words, so it's a blackout.
If there is this blackout, what are people to do?
Well, first of all, they're first as citizen advocates. They can push the major parties and say, we're registered Democrat or we're registered Republican, but we're going to condition our vote. We're not going to vote just because were labeled Democratic Party voter or Republican Party voter. So they can begin telling the candidates when they campaign in the communities, instead of just shaking hands and smiling with the candidates, they can condition. I always say, vote your conscience. If you don't vote your conscience, what are you voting? You're voting for least worst. Once you vote least worst, you're in a trap, and it never stops every 4 years.
Yeah.
They got you.
Right.
Because there'll always be a least worst. The only way you can pull them toward honest elections that represent the interests of all the people, not the corporate supremacists and corporate lobbies, is to vote your conscience.
Okay, I hear you say that, and then I want to posit an actual example, because when people learned that you were going to be on the show, they had questions. Something I got from several people is, ask him what we should do in November. So you're saying vote your conscience. But to this day, we do still have that age-old argument that voters should stick to the two-party system and vote for the lesser of two evils. Unfortunately for many this year, in the face of Israel's war in Gaza and the U.S.'s staunch support, there is no math that equates to the lesser. So, for example, in Chicago, my hometown, people use their vote in the primary election to protest by writing in Gaza. Where can disaffected voters turn? What should they do?
It depends what's important for you. If the most important thing is to stop the U.S. weaponization of Israeli genocide, killing your relatives in Gaza and the West Bank, you vote for people like Cornel West and Jill Stein, who have the best progressive agenda of any party candidates in the country. And if they're not on the ballot, you write them in.
What advice do you have for people who feel like the change from Biden to Kamala Harris was a shift to say the Democratic Party is listening to disaffected voters, but it's not enough?
Well, remember, there's over 5 months when Biden will remain as president. So she is not president. She has no power to change things right now. And Biden is getting weaker and weaker and more supportive of Netanyahu's most outrageous expansion of genocide and war in that whole Middle East region. So the only way to really get Kamala Harris's attention is to show her that you're going to deprive her of the vote. That's the only language they understand in the midst of an election. That vote is either going to stay home or it's going to go to the third party, like the Green Party or Cornel West. Otherwise, the Democratic Party specialists will say to these voters, keep quiet, you have nowhere else to go because Trump is even worse on the Middle East.
After the break, the Bush v. Gore controversy and the blame game. Ralph, many of our listeners will hear your name and they will think that the U.S. might be better off today if one of your 4 bids for president had been successful. I think that's a pretty large chunk of our listenership. But there are others who will think that your name is synonymous with the blame of siphoning off votes from Al Gore and his defeat against George W. Bush in the presidential race of 2000.
Remember, a slim margin changed the 2000 election. Double-digit support isn't necessary for a third-party candidate to be a spoiler. That's something Ralph Nader learned in 2000, and it's something some voters won't let him forget.
At what point in that race that featured all the problems of the Electoral College versus the popular vote, did you know that you were going to be made out to be a spoiler?
Well, first of all, I never thought the Democratic Party was so inept and they couldn't beat a bumbling Texas governor, George W. Bush, with a terrible record on children's policy, consumer, labor, environment in Texas. They couldn't landslide him because they're dialing for the same dollars and they have inhibited themselves from really representing broadly the interests of the people. Now, having said that, Al Gore won the election. In any other democracy, he won the popular vote by 500,000 voters all over the country. And we have an electoral college, which is about as anti-democratic as you can imagine, that threw it into Florida. And in Florida, the governor was George W. Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, and his compliant state secretary of state, who manipulated all kinds of votes and ballot designs to favor, guess what? George W. Bush. And the Democrats fumbled all over themselves in Florida and allowed the final count to be about 530 votes in favor of George W. Bush. And then the Florida Supreme Court ordered a statewide recount. It was underway, very likely that Gore would have won it, and the Republican-dominated U.S. Supreme Court intervened and selected George W. Bush as president. He was selected. He was not really elected. And that was a judicial coup d'etat. And now, the Democrats are very good at scapegoating. They scapegoated the Green Party. Instead of looking themselves in the mirror and making the list of all the blunders and failures, no, they wanted to blame the Green Party and its candidates. Now, Al Gore, when he's asked, he doesn't blame the Green Party. That's a pretty authoritative voice, isn't it?
Yeah.
He said the Democrats blew it.
I wonder for you, when you were running, knowing the odds that were stacked against you, what was your goal? Could you see yourself winning, or was it about pushing the party platform, making this country more progressive?
Well, it was all about pushing the platforms, the agendas of one or both of the two parties, and getting 5% or more of the vote. Because under federal law, if I got 5% or more of the vote in 2000, 4 years later, the Green Party would have qualified for millions of federal campaign dollars to make it able to grow even larger. Those were the two goals.
You mentioned the 5%, and I just want to explain for our international audience, that is this entitlement that a new party candidate receives partial funding after the election if they get 5% or more of the vote. Is that right?
That's correct.
Did you ever make that?
No, I got just under 3% of the vote, because the practice in American electoral politics is you can come in on the polls at 7, 8, 10%, but it shrinks on election day because people want to be with the winner. People grow up from when they're children being taught, look, there are only two parties that can win a presidential race. So they want to be with the winner, and even though they like the Green Party, they shift at the last minute and go for the winner, which they hope to be either the Democrat or Republican Party.
So we can't even really trust the polls.
No, you can't trust the polls for a simple reason, that when people are polled, they are told there is a third party candidate. They would say, here's the poll, George W. Bush, Republican, Al Gore, Democrat, Ralph Nader, Green Party. So they have the name of the third party. But in actual practice, millions of voters don't even know that the third party candidate is running. I was one of the best known people of America as a consumer advocate, but the vast majority of the people never knew I was running for president. They never saw me on national TV. In spite of popular polls, they never saw me on the national presidential debates with 50 to 100 million viewers.
Wow.
They almost never saw me written up in the newspapers. So how could they go to the polls and decide to vote for me if they don't know I am running? So this is part of the blackout that the media is complicit in, not just the politicians.
And that's really saying something because, as you mentioned, before your campaigns for president, you became pretty famous for being a young lawyer and then an author who advocated for consumers, for improving the lives of average people.
Live from New York, it's Saturday night.
You were even on Saturday Night Live, which arguably is a very big platform for people to know who you are and what you're about.
Starring Ralph Nader.
We have you to thank for the fact that cars in the U.S. today have things like seatbelts, that Americans now have the right to clean drinking water, that whistleblowers have protection against retaliation. So first of all, thank you. But second of all, do you feel like there's more or less room for someone like you now in our current political system?
Oh, it's less room. Our democracy is shrinking by the decade, not just in terms of election choices and voices. The civic groups used to get their reports, testimonies, lawsuits in the New York Times, Washington Post, AP, Reuters. That doesn't happen anymore. They're excluded. They're not quoted. They have a hard time getting op-eds in newspapers. It's much worse now than it was. I don't think we could have gotten the great environmental laws, consumer protection laws, worker safety laws that we got in the late 60s and early 70s today. We probably wouldn't even get hearings in Congress. I've just written a book called Let's Start the Revolution. Let's work to make our country work for all its people. And it's a blueprint for any candidate for office this year, 2024, whether local, state, national, or presidential, on how to win an election by representing the interests of all the people, not just conservative workers or liberal workers or conservative patients or liberal patients, etc. This book just came out, and it too will probably not get much attention by the New York Times or Washington Post. So we have to regroup as we did in the late 50s and start a civic movement all over again. Because all it takes is 1% of the people back in the congressional districts, sometimes less than 1%, as long as it represents broad public opinion. They know what they're talking about, and they laser-like focus on the tiny number of legislators that can make the difference in their lives.
Wow. Well, Ralph, I'll just have one final question, and that is, will anything surprise you come November?
Yeah, what will surprise me is if a chronic liar, a thief, a narcissist, an ignoramus, a slanderer, an abuser of women, someone who's indifferent to the rights of workers, someone who represents Wall Street, someone who wants to cripple the civil service and federal government, someone who pushes for tax cuts for the wealthy, including him and his own family, can be elected president of the United States. And remember what Donald Trump said in July 2019. He said, quote, "With Article 2, I can do whatever I want as president," end quote. That has been described by constitutional experts as an impeachable offense in and of itself, a statement of raw lawlessness which he expressed and implemented as president of the United States.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Sari el-Khalili and Ashish Malhotra, with Khaled Soltan, Duha Mosaad, Veronique Eshaya, Shraddha Joshi, Manahil Naveed, and me, Malika Bilal. It was edited by Noor Wazwaz. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Ney Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.